first thing that pops into your mind when you think about the great British seaside? Is it fish and chips? Is it ice cream? Is it paddling in the sea? Well, if you'd asked the same questions to our Victorian ancestors, or even further back than that, you may have got a very, very different answer, because the seaside has been home to some rather strange and bizarre traditions over the years.
It wasn't always just buckets, spades and unpredictable weather. For generations, a trip to the coast came with some rather questionable ideas about what constituted a good day out. There were supposed cures that sound considerably worse than the illness, entertainment that probably wouldn't make it past the first health and safety meeting today, and some hygiene standards that are best described as optimistic. And the strangest thing about all of this, none of it was particularly strange at the time. These were things ordinary people did, things they paid money for, things doctors actually recommended. So before we start feeling too smug about how far we've come, let's head back to a time when a day at the seaside could involve considerably more than paddling the sea and wondering why you didn't bring a coat.
Hello friends, and welcome back to the channel. So if you're new here, I'm Claire, this is the Wanderlust Way. First off, let me say a massive thank you to everybody that supports the channel by liking, commenting, subscribing and sharing, and of course the members and those that send super thanks and donations, because you're the ones that are helping the channel to keep grow, and you're helping me to carry on each week bringing out a new video in a new location. So today we are on the Lincolnshire coast and we're in Cleethorpes, but the story that I'm telling you today is not specific about Cleethorpes. It could be anywhere up and down the British UK coastline. I've done a bit of digging into history, and I've chosen 5 really strange things that we've done in the past that might question some of the things we did. So stay to the end, because number 5, by the time you get to that one, you might not judge our ancestors so hard. Anyway, that's enough waffle, let's wander. If you're not new to the channel, then you'll know we are no stranger to dark and grim stories here. We've often spoken about executions in the past and how they have gathered quite large crowds. Now here at the seaside, I'm not talking about executions, but I am talking about something that's just as tragic. And all we need really for this to work is the coast, a tragedy unfolding, and a curious gathering of spectators.
Picture the scene. You're at the seaside, you've found yourself a nice spot up on the cliffs, you've got a cracking view of the coastline. And out at sea, a ship is in serious trouble. People start gathering around you, more and more arrive until there's a crowd standing there watching the whole thing unfold. Now, I'm not saying the Victorians actually got out the picnic blankets and started passing round the sandwiches, but it does paint a rather disturbing picture of what could constitute a day out at the seaside. Because when ships ran into trouble close enough to the British coastline, people did gather to watch. Of course, some would have been genuinely concerned, some may have wanted to help. But let's not kid ourselves, there's another reason humans gather when something terrible is happening. We want to see. Morbid curiosity is nothing new, and shipwrecks provided it in abundance. Imagine standing safely on the cliffs watching a ship being battered by the waves below. You might be watching cargo disappear into the sea. You might be watching the ship itself break apart. And in the worst cases, you could be watching people fighting for their lives. Yet somehow, you can't look away. And our fascination didn't necessarily end once the danger had passed either. In 1906, HMS Montague, an enormous Royal Navy battleship, ran aground on rocks off Lundy Island in the thick fog. Thankfully, nobody died. But once word got around that this huge battleship was stuck beneath the cliffs, well, everybody wanted to see it. Excursion boats began carrying sightseers out specifically to visit the wreck. Postcards were produced, souvenirs were taken. An entire little tourist trade sprang up around a naval disaster. Basically, hey, what are we doing this Saturday? Well, you know what, I thought we'd pack some sandwiches and go and have a look round that shipwreck. And it happened again. In 1919, the German submarine U-118 washed up on the beach at Hastings. This became such an attraction that visitors could actually pay to go aboard. But maybe we shouldn't judge our ancestors too harshly, because let's face it, we are still fascinated by shipwrecks. People travel around the world to dive them. We visit wreck sites and maritime museums. And more than a century later, we are still completely fascinated by disasters like the Titanic. There's nothing particularly strange about wanting to explore a piece of history, but there is a difference between visiting a wreck and watching the wrecking happening. And I think that's where this one gets a little bit uncomfortable, because we'd all like to think that if we were standing on that cliff watching people fighting for their lives below, we would turn away. But would we? Think about what happens when there's an accident on the motorway. People slow down. Something terrible happens in public. Phones come out. We know we probably shouldn't look, but some of us still do. So perhaps our ancestors weren't uniquely morbid after all. Maybe the only real difference is they had the cliffside, we've got the screen.
Now, I don't know about you, but there is just something about being at the coast. Something about the sea air, and I personally, for one, whenever I go home and I've been at the seaside, I always go home and go, oh, the sea air. And generally it's because I'm feeling really tired. I'm not blaming the fish and chips, I'm blaming the sea air. Well, in the past, our ancestors, the doctors would often prescribe a day trip, or even longer, to the seaside to get rid of all sorts of ailments, which is great. However, if he prescribed you something on the side, then I think you really should be asking for a second opinion.
Hands up who's ever been told that cautionary tale, that if you ever find yourself stranded at sea, with no food, no fresh water, and absolutely no hope in sight, whatever you do not drink the seawater. Now, this is something that I remember being told quite vividly, and there's a very good reason for it. Our kidneys simply can't cope with the amount of salt in seawater. So in order to get rid of it, your body actually has to use more water than you've just drunk. So rather than quenching your thirst, you're dehydrating yourself even faster. Keep going and eventually it can kill you. And that makes sense to me. Which is why I was rather surprised to discover that in the 18th century, doctors were actually telling people to drink it. And one man in particular helped turn this into something of a health craze. Dr. Richard Russell was a physician from Sussex who, in 1750, published his ideas about using seawater to treat a whole host of complaints. And his advice wasn't just to get yourself down to the coast and breathe in a bit of sea air. No, you were to drink that stuff, and you were to get in it. And people listened. Russell's ideas became incredibly fashionable, particularly amongst the wealthy. Patients began travelling to the Sussex coast to try these seawater treatments, helping places like Brighton grow into fashionable seaside resorts. But if drinking the sea sounds bad enough, wait until you hear what happened next. Because getting into it wasn't necessarily a case of putting your swimming costume on and going for a leisurely paddle. And let's just remind ourselves that a lot of visitors couldn't actually swim back then. But no problemo, this is where the dipper comes in. Now, dippers were strong bathing attendants who would accompany you into the water and make sure you received that prescribed number of therapeutic dunkings. And when I say dunking, I mean dunking. You could be lowered or plunged into the sea, completely submerged and brought back up again, potentially more than once. So just imagine this for a minute. You've gone to the doctor because you're not feeling very well. He sent you to the seaside. You've drunk a load of seawater. You've been wheeled towards the sea inside what is essentially a shed on wheels. And now there's a rather sturdy woman waiting outside whose job is to shove you underneath it. Apparently this is making you better. And this wasn't some obscure treatment that only a handful of people were daft enough to try. Jane Austen herself used the services of a dipper. While staying at the seaside, she wrote about bathing with a woman thought to have been her dipper, Molly. And Jane apparently enjoyed sea bathing so much that on one occasion she stayed in the water too long and spent the rest of the day feeling exhausted. So perhaps the dippers weren't quite the seaside assassins I'm making them sound. But bizarre as all this seems now, The craze for seawater treatments helped change the British seaside forever, because people came for their health and discovered they rather liked being by the sea. Seaside resorts grew, bathing became fashionable, and eventually we stopped needing a doctor's note to come here. And thankfully, somewhere along the way, we also stopped drinking it.
Having an ice cream is perhaps one of the most iconic things you can do at the seaside. However, in the Victorian times, it wasn't quite like this. And you might get a side of something else on your ice cream, and I'm not talking sprinkles.
First up, you may have already noticed that on this particular day of filming, the Lincolnshire coastline was very much against me and my ice cream. The delicious white choc chip melting down my fingers as the occasional gust of wind blew my hair into the cream. But I carried on smiling, and the reason I did that is I, for one, am quite thankful for this cone of ice cream, and you would be too if you knew what our ancestors had to deal with. Because had I bought this ice cream in the late 1800s, there's a good chance it wouldn't have come in a cone at all. Instead, for the princely sum of 1 penny, it could be served in one of these. A penny lick. Now, the penny lick was a small glass with a very thick bottom and a shallow dip in the top which held your ice cream. And that thick glass was actually really clever, because from the outside it looked like you were getting a decent portion, when in reality there wasn't much ice cream in there at all. So you've already been slightly conned, but never mind, you've got your ice cream. Now, there's no spoon though, so you have to lick it straight out of the glass. Alright, fair enough. But then you have to hand the empty glass back to the seller, and they give it to the next person. Yeah, the same glass. Now that's alright, you might be thinking, they'll give it a wash, won't they? Well, no they wouldn't, or at least certainly not always. Now, in 1879, medical journal The Lancet described how glasses used by ice cream sellers were cleaned by dipping them into dirty water containing what it rather wonderfully described as the mouth secretions of previous buyers. Lovely. They could then be wiped with a small wet cloth and put back on the barrow, ready for the next customer. And remember, we're doing this in the 19th century. Tuberculosis was rife, cholera outbreaks were still within living memory, and let's face it, not everybody was brushing their teeth. Germ theory, however, was only gradually becoming accepted, and for much of the century, people didn't even understand disease transmission in the way we do today. Thankfully though, by the end of the century, the penny had finally dropped, and concerns about penny licks spreading diseases such as tuberculosis and cholera had become serious enough that London authorities moved against them, and in 1899 their use was banned in the capital. Oh no, what will we do? Well, thankfully some bright sparks had already put their thinking caps on, and ta-da! Instead of putting your ice cream in something that needed washing, why not put it in something you could eat? And along comes the cone. Edible wafers and cones began appearing around this period, and in 1902 an Italian living in Manchester called Antonio Valvona patented a machine for making biscuit cups for ice cream. And suddenly there was no glass to give back, no bucket of other people's spit, and no filthy rag. You ate the ice cream and then you ate the container. Genius. So the next time you're at the seaside complaining that a 99 costs about £4, just remember what your Victorian penny bought you. A tiny portion of ice cream, a glass that half the promenade had already licked, and possibly a complimentary infectious disease. I think I'll pay the £4, thank you very much.
So I'm sure a lot of you already know that entertainment has always been a big part of the seaside, and in the past there have been some quite questionable things happening, freak shows for example, and animal attractions, things like that, you know, probably best left in the past. Now the next one, when I first found out about this, I was really shocked. However, when I started digging a little bit deeper, I realised that it was nothing short of actually a little miracle.
Our fourth story is quite a controversial one, but when we look a little deeper, there is much more to it than our first reaction might suggest. And I'm talking about the incubator baby exhibitions. And to understand this one, we need to meet a man called Martin Cowney. Now, back in 1897, thousands of people descended on Earl's Court in London for the huge Victorian era exhibition. It was basically a massive celebration of Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee, part exhibition, part entertainment complex, and part grand day out. And amongst all of this, Cowney and his business partner had brought along something rather unexpected: premature babies. They were real, living, premature babies that were being cared for inside some of the most advanced incubators of the time, and members of the public were paying to see them. People were absolutely fascinated by this, and around 3,600 visitors reportedly came on the first day alone. And by the end of the summer, it's estimated that more than 200,000 people had seen these babies. And here's where the Great British Seaside comes in, because within weeks, an Imperial Baby Incubator exhibition was being advertised at Blackpool's Winter Gardens. It was a rival operation apparently inspired by the success of Earl's Court. So yeah, incubator babies had made their way to the Great British Seaside. Now obviously the whole idea can sound pretty horrific to some people, but being born prematurely in the 1890s could mean there was very little anyone could do for you. Incubators were still relatively new, and the earliest French designs had actually developed from the same principle as incubators used for baby chickens. But they worked. I mean, premature babies, they struggle to regulate their own body temperature, and these machines provided the warm, controlled environment that they desperately needed. And Cowney took the care of the babies seriously. But here's the part that some people find a little bit more uncomfortable. When British doctors wouldn't provide premature infants for the Earl's Court exhibition, babies were actually brought in over from Paris in wicker baskets, travelling by cab, train and steamer. Now, once inside the exhibition, however, this wasn't simply a row of babies being gawped at. There were trained nurses, wet nurses, feeding and washing took place privately, and the public viewed the babies in a separate central room. And this is where the story gets interesting, because the spectators weren't just looking at the babies. Their admission money was helping to pay for their care. So Cowney had realised he had found a model that worked and helped. He went on to exhibit premature babies at fairs and amusement parks around the world, and eventually became famous for his long-running exhibitions at Coney Island in America. So yeah, by today's standards, there's something deeply uncomfortable about putting vulnerable babies on display for paying spectators. But those exhibitions also showed enormous numbers of people that premature babies weren't necessarily beyond saving. So what do you think? Was it exploitation? Was it entertainment? Was it medicine? I think the uncomfortable answer is that it's probably a little bit of all three. But for some of those tiny babies inside the incubators, it was their fighting chance.
Now that just leaves us with one final one. And bear in mind that these seaside communities, they really took a boom in the Victorian ages. People were coming from all over the country with the thanks to the railways, and these small seaside communities all of a sudden saw a lot of tourists. Now this was absolutely fantastic for business, but it created one small problem. Well, one big problem in fact, sewerage. But don't worry, the Victorians had an answer for that as well.
So with all these people now flocking to the seaside, what did they do with all the waste? Well, I had a look into this, and I'll give you Brighton as the first example. By 1850, it had grown into a thriving seaside resort with around 60,000 residents. But it didn't have a proper sewerage system, and much of the waste was ending up in cesspools behind people's houses. So they came up with a seemingly simple solution. Just pump it into the sea. After all, the sea is absolutely enormous. It moves, there are tides, and surely if you put the sewerage in there, nature carries it away. Problem solved. Except of course it wasn't, because every time all you've actually done is move your sewerage from where everybody lives to where everybody swims. And Brighton wasn't alone. As Britain's towns and seaside resorts grew during the 19th century, engineers increasingly had to work out how to move huge quantities of human waste away from rapidly growing populations. The sea became one very convenient place to put it, quite literally. Out of sight, out of mind. Although unfortunately, not necessarily out of swimming distance.
So I think we can all agree that it is a pretty grim thing to do, pumping raw sewerage into the sea, especially if you've been prescribed by the doctor to drink such seawater. Now, thankfully, in our modern day, we don't have to worry about things like that, do we? We've got modern sanitation in progress. We're not pumping raw, untreated sewerage into the sea anymore, or are we?
Some of you may already know where I'm going with this, but if not, then brace yourselves, because I'm afraid I've got some rather bad news. Because even though this is 2026 and we are supposed to be so much more modern, we still haven't entirely stopped putting raw human waste into the sea. Yet, we still do that here in Britain. Now, there is an important difference. Our everyday sewage is usually taken away, treated and cleaned before the treated wastewater is released back into the environment. But notice how I said usually, because much of Britain still has what's called a combined sewer system. Basically, the water from our toilets, sinks, showers can travel through the same pipes as rainwater running off the streets and roofs. Most of the time that mixture goes off to be treated. But then Britain does something that Britain's really good at. It rains. Quite a lot. And during particular heavy rainfall, so much water can enter the system that the sewers risk becoming overwhelmed. So rather than having sewage backing up into streets or people's homes, the system has an emergency escape valve called a storm overflow. And that allows the excess rainwater mixed with the wastewater to be discharged into the rivers and into the sea. And under certain conditions, that is perfectly legal. Now, given the choice between that and raw sewage coming back up into our bathrooms, I reckon I can take a guess as to what the majority of people would probably choose. But the controversy is how often we've ended up relying on this. Now, even the Environment Agency has said the current level of storm overflow use is unacceptable. But here's the frustrating bit. There are things we can do. More storage, better treatment works, upgraded sewers, and perhaps most obviously, stop putting quite so much rainwater into the same pipes as our poo. And before anybody says, well, yeah, but this is Britain, it rains, we're not the only ones that are dealing with this. Take the Netherlands. They're another northwest European country with plenty of rain, old cities, and some of the same problems with combined sewers. But in newer areas of Amsterdam, rainwater and wastewater travel through separate systems. And where old combined systems remain, large underground basins can temporarily store excess water during heavy rain until it can be sent away for treatment. So we're not talking about some futuristic technology here. We are basically talking about better drains. Now, obviously, Britain isn't going to dig up a sewer network that's been developing underneath our feet for well over a century overnight. And it's going to cost a lot of money. But to be fair, work is being done. And some of the wider targets I've seen are there to reduce the harm caused by storm overflow that stretch all the way to 2050. So apparently this particular bizarre seaside tradition is one we're going to be stuck with for a little bit longer. I mean, come on, Britain. Surely in 2026 we can agree on one thing. The sea shouldn't be still acting as our emergency toilet.
So I have just got one last fun fact for you. It's more fun than depressing and grim, this one. But before I do that, let me say a massive thank you to everybody that's watched the video. Really do appreciate it. And do stay tuned because there will be another video next week. And thank you to my camera people today that have helped me out in such a windy conditions. Right, so that last fun fact. Fish and chips. Everybody thinks it's a traditional British staple. But did you know, because I've only just found out about this, that it's not actually British. So fish, the fried fish, apparently comes from Spain and Portugal, and fried chips are actually from continental Europe. So there we go, every day's a school day.